treasure chasing golden dog. And guess what? My best friend Dad and I go on the coolest adventures. We've got a big black Jeep named Berty, a whole world to explore, and, of course, plenty of snacks. Every week is a brand new tail-wagging adventure. You never know what we'll find. Hidden carrots, new friends, maybe even buried treasure. So grab your hat, pack your snacks, and come with us.
Harley and Dad and the Plumbing Predicament. The sun was shining through the kitchen window on Thursday morning as Harley sat on his mat watching Dad make breakfast. Bacon was frying, and when bacon was frying, Harley was focused on the bacon. Harley tilted his head and looked toward the sink. "Dad," he said, "the tap is making a noise." Much to Harley's dismay, Dad stopped frying bacon and looked at the tap, listening. "It certainly is," he said. Harley tilted his head the other way. "Is it supposed to do that?" "Nope," said Dad, and pushed the handle down. "There," he said, "that should fix it." Harley looked at Dad. Dad looked at Harley. "I think it's broken," Harley whispered. Dad rolled up his sleeves. "Well, I guess we better get some tools and fix it then." Harley looked alarmed. "Now? Before bacon?" Dad laughed and ruffled the top of Harley's head. "Don't worry, buddy. Bacon first. Then we can be plumbers." After breakfast, Dad went out to the garage to get his toolbox. By the time he was back, Harley was ready to help. He had his hard hat on and a Harley-sized tool belt. Dad nodded in approval, and they both headed to the sink. "Right," Dad said. "Let's take off the handle and see what's what." He held out his hand to Harley. "Screwdriver, please, assistant." "Screwdriver," Harley said, full of enthusiasm, and handed Dad a wrench. "Thanks, buddy," Dad said, trying not to grin. "Can I have the smaller one? Looks a bit like a long marshmallow on a stick, yellow handle." Harley looked on his tool belt and pulled out the screwdriver, handing it to Dad. "It's a hot dog on a stick, not a marshmallow." "Sorry," Dad said. "I'll try to be more specific from now on." Harley gave him a nod and watched as Dad took the handle off and then pulled out some weird-looking little piece, taking a good look at it. "Aha," he said, "here's our culprit. The cartridge is cracked." "What's a cartridge?" Harley asked. "This is the cartridge," Dad explained. "We need to find another one just like it." Harley stared at the tiny cartridge. "That's all?" "That's all." "Well, that should be easy." "Piece of cake," Dad said. "Want to come to the hardware store?" Dad was talking to empty space. He looked out the now open door and saw Harley scrambling his way into Berty the Jeep. "Well, I guess you do," Dad muttered with a grin, and joined Harley in Berty. "Buckle up, buddy. Maplewood Hardware, here we come." Inside Maplewood Hardware, Dad placed the cartridge on the counter. The clerk picked it up and squinted at it. He turned it over. He held it up to the light. Then he disappeared behind a wall of tiny drawers. Harley watched eagerly. The clerk came back and shook his head. "Sorry, we don't have one of those." Dad picked up the cartridge. "Any idea who might?" The clerk wrote down the name of another hardware store. Harley looked at Dad. "Well, that was quick." "Don't worry," Dad said. "The next place will have it." The next place did not have it. The clerk there turned the cartridge over, held it up to the light, and sent them to a plumbing store across town. The plumbing store did not have it either. Their clerk turned it over, held it up to the light, and sent them to an even bigger hardware store. Harley climbed back into Berty. Dad? Yes, buddy. Why does everybody hold it up to the light? Dad looked at the tiny cartridge in his hand. I have absolutely no idea. At the fourth store, 2 clerks looked at the cartridge. At the 5th store, 3 clerks looked at the cartridge. At the 6th store, a clerk looked at the cartridge, looked at Dad, and said, Have you tried Maplewood Hardware? Dad blinked. Harley blinked. That's where we started, Harley said. The clerk shrugged. Might be worth trying again. Back in Berty, Harley counted on his paws. We went to 6 stores, and now we're going back to the first store. That appears to be the plan, Dad said. So we drove in a giant circle. A very expensive giant circle. Harley thought about that. Well, at least Berty likes adventures. When they returned to Maplewood Hardware, a different clerk was standing behind the counter. Dad placed the cartridge in front of him. The clerk picked it up, he turned it over, he held it to the light. Harley leaned toward Dad. Here we go again. The clerk tapped on his computer for a while. I can order one, he finally said, but it may take several weeks. Several weeks? Dad asked. For weeks was the sound going through Harley's mind, and he groaned. The clerk pointed toward a row of shiny boxes. It might be easier to replace the whole tap. Dad chose a new tap and carried the box toward the till. Harley trotted beside him, staring at it. That box is much bigger than the little broken piece. It certainly is, Dad said. And we came here first. Yes, we did, Dad said. And they had a big box the whole time. They sure did, Dad said. Harley looked back toward the hardware store clerk. I'm starting to think plumbing is very strange. You may be onto something, Dad said. Back at home, Dad crawled beneath the kitchen sink while Harley stood beside the toolbox. Pliers, please, Dad called. Harley studied the tools carefully. Then he handed Dad the right one. Dad poked his head out from beneath the sink. You got it right. They look like crab claws, Harley explained. Well, of course they do. Dad disconnected the pipes and hoses. He removed the old tap and fit the shiny new one into the sink. Harley passed him tools, held the flashlight, and reminded him twice that it was nearly snack time. At last Dad climbed out from beneath the sink. Ready, he asked. Harley nodded. Dad turned the water back on and lifted the handle. Water rushed from the new tap. He pushed the handle down. The water stopped. Harley and Dad waited. No drip. They waited a little longer. Still no drip. We fixed it, Harley cheered. We certainly did, Dad said. Harley looked proudly at the new tap. Piece of cake. Dad laughed. A very large piece of cake. On Friday morning, Harley found Dad standing in the laundry room, looking down at a bucket. Harley peered over the edge. Are we keeping water in the house now? No, Dad said. The little pump has stopped working. Beside the bucket was a small machine with a hose attached to it. Water was slowly draining through the hose and landing in the bucket. Harley looked puzzled. What does the pump do? It collects water from the furnace and carries it away. So it's a water taxi. Dad nodded. Exactly. And our water taxi has broken down. Dad brought out a brand new pump and set it beside the old one. This should be simple, he said. Harley immediately put on his hard hat and tool belt. Dad disconnected the old pump and connected the new one. Everything was going perfectly until he tried to attach the hose. The hose would not fit. Dad pushed it. He twisted it. He tried it from the other direction. The hose still would not fit. Harley watched thoughtfully. Maybe it doesn't know it's supposed to be simple. Dad held up the old hose. We need a new one. Harley was already halfway to the door. Maplewood Hardware? Maplewood Hardware, Dad said. Harley raced outside and scrambled into Berty. Excellent! We haven't been there yet today. Dad groaned and started driving. At Maplewood Hardware, Dad found a long piece of hose that was exactly the right size. Only one store. No clerks held anything up to the light. No one sent them across town. No one suggested they drive to the city. Harley was almost disappointed. Are we sure we're allowed to go home already? Before somebody changes their mind, Dad said. Back in the laundry room, Dad attached the new hose. He poured a little water into the pump. The pump made a soft humming sound. Then the water whooshed through the hose and disappeared exactly where it was supposed to go. Harley's ears perked up. That's a good plumbing noise. That is a very good plumbing noise, Dad agreed. The bucket was empty. The pump was working. The kitchen tap was still not dripping. Harley and Dad celebrated with carrot sticks. On Saturday morning, Harley was walking past the bathroom when he heard it. He stopped. Harley closed his eyes. Dad? Dad appeared in the hallway. Harley pointed one paw toward the bathroom. It's happening again. Dad knelt beside the toilet and found a little drop of water beneath the tank. Aha, he said. One of the bolts is loose. He took out his wrench and carefully tightened it. There, that should do it. Harley stared at the toilet. Dad stared at the toilet. Nothing dripped. Fixed? Harley asked. Fixed, Dad said confidently. Harley slowly removed his hard hat. A short while later, Harley put his hard hat back on. Dad looked behind the toilet again. The bolt was tight, but the water was still sneaking out from between the tank and the bowl. Dad sighed. It isn't the bolt. What is it? Dad lifted the lid and looked inside the tank. I think it's the donut seal. Harley's eyes widened. There's a donut in the toilet? Not the tasty kind. Does it have icing? No. Sprinkles? No. Harley frowned. That is a very disappointing donut. Dad turned off the water to the toilet. Then he flushed it and waited while the tank emptied. Harley stood beside him with a towel ready. Dad disconnected the hose, removed the bolts, and carefully lifted the tank away from the bowl. Underneath was a thick, round rubber seal. It was flattened, cracked, and soggy. Dad held it up. There's our problem. Harley studied it. It doesn't look anything like a donut. Well, it did once. Well, that doesn't make it less disappointing, Dad. Dad put the old seal into a bag. Harley climbed into Berty and settled down for a long journey. Dad buckled himself in. Ready, buddy? Harley nodded bravely. We'll go to Maplewood first, he said. Then they'll send us to the second store. The second store will send us to the third store. We'll visit 6 stores, and the 6th store will send us back to Maplewood. You've really thought this through, said Dad. I'm going to have a nap at stores 3 and 4. Dad started Berty. Good plan, buddy. They walked into Maplewood Hardware and placed the old donut seal on the counter. The clerk looked at it. Harley waited for him to turn it over. The clerk did not turn it over. Harley waited for him to hold it up to the light. The clerk did not hold it up to the light. Without saying a word, the clerk walked to a shelf, picked up a new seal, and handed it to Dad. Harley stared at him. Dad stared at him. The clerk smiled. "Anything else?" "That's it?" Harley asked. "That's it," Dad said. "He didn't even look on the computer." "No." "He didn't ask another clerk." "No." "He didn't send us across town." "No." Harley looked at the new donut seal. "It's exactly the same?" "Exactly." Harley looked suspiciously around the store. "What's the catch?" Dad tucked the seal safely under his arm. "Let's leave before we find out." Back in Berty, Harley looked hopefully at Dad. "All this talk about donuts has got me peckish, Dad. Can we stop at the buttered biscuit on our way out?" "That," said Dad, "is the best idea I've heard in days. Let's pop in on Patty and get a donut for you and a blueberry scone for me." They pulled up outside Patty's cafe and Harley bounced through the door, Dad following behind. Patty looked up from behind the counter. "Dad, Harley, this is a nice surprise. What can I get for you?" "Good to see you, Patty," said Dad. "A blueberry scone for me and a biscuit donut for Harley, please." "It's not for the toilet, though," Harley added quickly. Patty gave Harley an odd look, but put a scone and a donut in a small brown bag and handed it over to Dad. "Sure. Okay. That's good?" She turned to Dad. $2.50, Dad." Dad paid her, and they both jumped back into Berty. All the way back, Dad was grinning. Harley didn't know what was so funny, but also honestly didn't care. He had a donut. Back at home, Dad fitted the new donut seal into place. He carefully lowered the tank onto the toilet bowl. Harley handed him the bolts, and Dad tightened them. Harley handed him the wrench. It was the correct wrench. "You're getting very good at this," Dad said. "I'm a professional plumber now," Harley replied. Dad connected the water hose and turned the water back on. Slowly, the tank began to fill. Harley and Dad stood in front of the toilet. Dad rested one hand on the handle. "Ready?" Harley pulled his hard hat down firmly. "Ready." Dad flushed. Whoosh! The water swirled around the bowl. The tank emptied. Then it began to fill again. Harley and Dad listened. The tank stopped filling. There was no drip underneath the bolt. There was no drip between the tank and the bowl. There was no water on the floor. There was only silence. Glorious, wonderful silence. Harley let out a happy bark. "We did it!" Dad lifted him into the air. "We did!" The tap was quiet. The pump was humming only when it was supposed to. The toilet flushed perfectly. Harley and Dad packed away the toolbox, the hard hat, and Harley's tool belt. Dad looked down at his assistant. 3 plumbing problems fixed in 3 days. "And only 8 hardware stores," Harley said proudly. "Some of them more than once." "Well, that still counts." On Sunday morning, the sun shone through the kitchen window as Dad made breakfast. Bacon was frying, and when bacon was frying, Harley was focused on the bacon. The kitchen tap stood shiny and silent beside the sink. Dad looked at Harley, and Harley looked at Dad. "Do professional plumbers get paid in bacon?" Harley asked. "The very best ones do," Dad said, handing him one tiny piece. Harley crunched it happily. Best plumbing adventure ever.
What a great day that turned out to be! Best day ever! I can't wait until next week when we go on another adventure! Make sure you click subscribe so you can join me